Another domain that we're gonna need is going to be an HTTP response domain. Now, the reason we need this domain is because we want to have a very uniform way to give a response to a user. This is gonna be an API, right? It's gonna be an API that you can access over the internet using HTTP, and every time there's a request, we have to send a response, right? If the response is successful, let's say it's a list of users that we're returning for a successful request, then we can return that specific collection of users. Or if there's an error, we always want our error HTTP response to be the same every time. So we want to have a uniform way of sending a response back to the user. So that's what we're going to do. And this is a very crucial thing in API design, because you want your API to be very consistent throughout the entire application. If you don't do that, for instance, if there's an error, right, and this error is like a very deep layered error that's like bubbling up and you don't know what caused it, so it's gonna throw some random string or some random long error with a very long message to the user, and you don't want that to happen, because that's going to expose the internal workings of your actual application. So you always want to be able to capture every request and then send a response every single time. You don't want the application to just to break. Let's say the user was supposed to send a number, but they sent in a string, and then that caused the application to trip or to cause an exception. Well, you don't want that exception to be sent back to the user, which is a bunch of information about what just happened, because that's going to reveal way too much information about your application, and your security is going to be exposed. So you don't want to do that. So that's why this is very important. So let's go back to the same domain package. We're going to go ahead and right click and go to new and create another class. And this class is going to be called HTTP response, right? So it's going to be the response that we send to the user every time. Now we don't need to serialize this, but let's give it a private int HTTP status code. Okay, so if you're familiar with HTTP, you already know a lot of these things. Things like HTTP, a reason and a message and a status code, HTTP status. So you know there's like a bunch of code, like for something that was successful, that's 200. If something was created, like if you're saving some information or creating a user or something, and something was created, is 201. And you should know that everything in the 200 range is something that's successful. Everything in the 500 range is some server error, and everything in the 400 range, I believe, is some user error. So maybe they're supposed to go to a specific URL and they don't, and things like that. So that's gonna throw some 400 error. So that's gonna, this int, which is why it's an int, because those are like regular numbers. So that's gonna represent the actual HTTP status code. Let's also let's give this an HTTP status. So let's do this type of, this is gonna be HTTP status, and that's coming from Spring, and that's just gonna be an HTTP status. So we can take a look at this real quick so we can see what's inside of this. So if you press Control and you click on that, it's gonna take you to the actual class, right, from Spring. And you can see it's an enum, like an enumeration, and it's got all the phrase, I believe they call those reason phrase, in the actual code, and the reason phrase again, but represented as a string. So for instance, if I do Control F and search for like 200, you can see 200, it's an okay response. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And the code is 200, and the actual phrase or reason phrase or whatever is okay. And it's 201 for created, and also created for the actual message, so, or reason phrase. So this is what this is. That's why I'm giving it this actual HTTP status. So I have access to this massive information. So of course, since I'm mapping this, the next thing is going to be a reason, which is going to be a string, and it's going to be the reason. Now the reason is going to be, let me go back to this 1 second. The reason is going to be this, like this is the reason. Like it's like a phrase. Like for this HTTP status, here's the phrase for it. They have some of them that are deprecated, but you get the idea. Let's search for 500. So here's 500 internal server error, and it's the same. I guess this is always going to be the same, but it's very nice that they build the enum that way, because then we can access all of this information. We can access this. I didn't even have to create my own. I could have just used this, but I just want to show you how I'm mapping everything so that you can have complete control over your API application. So this is going to be that, and let's give it a message, right? So that's going to be a developer message, for instance. Let's do this. Of course, it's going to be a string message, right? So this is going to be your message. So if, for instance, if you're sending some information back, it might just look like let's say it's a JSON, for instance, right? So you're going to do the code 200, right? And HTTP status, right? That's going to be okay, right? That's the let's see. So that's the one for, it's for a 200 OK HTTP status code. It's gonna be OK is gonna be the reason. And then let's say let's do, for instance, the reason, right? Would be like this, and then I guess it's OK because that's how it is in the actual. As you can see, like for 500 internal server error, then it's gonna be this. Like if we do OK, we search for OK, you see OK is OK. So our phrase is also gonna be OK. And for the actual message, right? So we can do message. That's a developer message. So it can say, I don't know, your request. Oops. I don't know why this keeps happening. It thinks I'm making a mistake, so it's trying to help me with intelligence. So your request was successful, like something like that, like some very descriptive message. So this class, this HTTP response, it's going to be looking something like this. So every time there's a request in my application, it's going to return something that's going to have these properties every single time. And this is very important because you want your API not only to have control over what's being sent back to the user in case like there's an error or something, but you have to make sure that you take control over what's being sent back so that you can mitigate. That's supposed to be a colon. I just want to make sure I'm sticking to JSON here. So this is, of course, if it's JSON, this is going to be a string. This message is reason code is going to be also a string. It should be, let's say this is also a string for, and this is, I guess, a number, so it's fine. So that's at least I have to do JSON justice for all my front-end developers. So here's our JSON, right? It's going to look like this every time. So it's going to have a message, it's going to have a reason code, it's going to have an HTTP status, and it's going to have the actual HTTP status code. So that's what we're representing here in this class. So with that being said, let's remove all of this and let's create some getters and setters. So I'm going to do some constructors first, everything, and constructor without any parameters. I can do that. And then I can do some getters and setters. So getters and setters, and I want everything. Okay. All right. So this class will represent all of our response that we're sending back in case the response is something that we're building. Meaning if they send a request and they're asking for like some list of users, then we send them the list. But otherwise, we will send them something else. If there's an error, if there is something was successful, but there is nothing we're sending back in the response body, then we're gonna go ahead and send them something that's gonna map this actual HTTP response every single time, so that we can have our API be very consistent. Okay, so that's that. And this is not gonna be mapped to a database. This is gonna live in the application itself. So we don't need to add anything on here. We don't need an ID for it or anything like that, because it's not gonna be mapped as a table in the database. And it doesn't need the entity because we're not mapping it. And we just need to create the constructors for it. When we need to construct it, these are an empty one. I wouldn't have this at all, because I don't want an empty or the default values for all those properties to be created. For instance, if we create an empty object of this class, it's gonna have 0 as the status code, and that's not even a valid status code. And this is gonna be null because it's a string, and this is also gonna be null. So we don't want that. So you wouldn't really have that constructor like that. You would either have the getters and setters and this constructor, because you don't want them to be able to create an HTTP response and send it back, and the status code is like 0, because that's the default for an int, or the message. Well, the message can be null, but you would usually want to send like a useful message, because that's the whole point of having the message itself. So yeah, I would probably remove that in production, but we can leave it, not a problem. Okay, so that's going to be the class that's going to represent all of our HTTP response.